How lovely is your dwelling place, O Lord of hosts. My soul longs, indeed it faints for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh sing for joy to the living God. In season 1 of the Dwelling Place podcast, this longing took me on a 6-month journey around the UK to dwell with a variety of intentional Christian communities, sharing interviews with community members, leaders, and founders along the way. In this second season of the Dwelling Place podcast, I invite you to join me in the US as I occasionally visit intentional Christian communities and share community-related interviews in the midst of my seminary education. In sharing these conversations, exploring the blessings, challenges, and wisdom of intentional Christian communal living, I hope to share glimpses of the transforming presence of the living God and inspire how it is we might be called to contribute to making God's kingdom manifest on earth, enabling people, God's beloved, to experience God's loving dwelling place.
Shane Claiborne is a very prominent speaker, activist, and best-selling author. He worked with Mother Teresa in Calcutta and founded The Simple Way in Philadelphia. And he heads up an organization called Red Letter Christians, which is a movement committed to living as if Jesus actually meant all the stuff that he said. Shane's a champion for grace, which has led him to jail, advocating for the homeless, and in places like Iraq and Afghanistan to stand against war. Now grace fuels his passion to end the death penalty and also help stop gun violence. And this workshop in particular is going to focus on new monasticism, which is a movement within contemporary Christianity in pursuit of peaceful communities. Shane speaks regularly at gatherings, festivals, and conferences all around the world. We're really lucky to have him here with us in Richmond. Without further ado, Shane Claiborne.
Well, thanks. Thanks so much for having me out, and I'm really thrilled to be here, make the most of it for a day in Richmond. So thanks for coming out. I don't know exactly what brings you to this space, but I'm going to just share a little bit, and then we're going to leave it wide open. I got my southern accent because I'm from Tennessee, and I grew up. I grew up in the same hills as Dolly Parton. My great-grandparents' house is still, you can still see the chimney, it's left there. And Dolly Parton used to play the guitar apparently on the porch up the street. And they didn't have running water or anything, but that's where my people are from. And then I ended up in Philly 25 years ago or so to go to undergrad to a wonderful little community at Eastern University. And it's about a half hour outside of Philly. So that's where I came from today. I have a 3-month-old little baby, so I was up all night. And but it's awesome. You know, when you're over 40 and you have a baby, they call it a geriatric pregnancy, which sounded a little dramatic when we first heard that, but now I feel geriatric. So it's all good. But we got this little 3-month-old kid, Elijah, and I've been building a community on the north side of Philly for 25 years. We just celebrated a quarter of a century. And I think for this first opening session, I am going to talk a little bit about the idea of community living. But you know, the language that we've tried to put to it gets a little clunky. You know, I'm not sure that everybody has, you know, that the language of new monasticism is meaningful to everyone. But I don't know. I grew up I don't think I would have known what that was for a long time. And so, but the word monastic really has at the heart of it the mono, like the one, to pursue one thing with all of our heart. And so I kind of think of it as just a passionate pursuit of love of God and love of neighbor, which seems to be at the heart of the Christian faith for me. I'm also aware that many folks that come to events like this come from traditions of other faiths or no particular faith and may not be religious at all, but I'll share a little bit about our experience and then we can open it up. But I'm really glad that you're here. And I brought some pictures. I want to be really careful not to feel like this is meant to be anecdotal or something, or you need to do what we're doing in Philly. But I bring photos because I think sometimes we stir each other's imagination. And for me, I think one of the best things we can do in an hour like this is not just prescribe, but provoke and to kind of stir each other on. And I come to find out, growing up in the stream of Christianity that I grew up in, that we were very focused on what you believe, the doctrines of our faith, right? And I think that's a part of the Christian faith. Like, the word orthodoxy is where we get doctrine from, right believing. But I think what we were struggling with was orthopraxy, which is where we get the word practice, right practice. How, like, the things we believe translate into real life, right? So I think one of the big challenges within Christianity is not just right thinking, but right living. And you can believe all this stuff on paper, but if it doesn't make you kinder and more loving, then what is it really worth, right? And in fact, there is even a scripture that talks about that, how we can have faith to move mountains and speak in the tongues of men and of angels, the Pentecostal tradition. We can do all sorts of miracles and prophecy, and we can fathom all the depths of knowledge. That's for the academics. But if we don't have love, it's still empty, right? So we've been leaning into that love, what is love? What does it look like to flesh out God's love? And a lot of folks that call themselves Christians are not that loving, And there are a lot of people that are really loving that don't really affiliate with Christianity. So what does that mean? Those are the questions we've kind of been stirring for 25 years. And just to give you a little bit of the snapshots of our community. So this is just, don't feel too formal, just like a little family photo album here. So when I was the age of some of you all, like 19 years old or so, we were in undergrad, and there was a crisis in Philadelphia around housing. So what had happened was we had homeless families all over our city. The fastest growing homeless population then and now is women and children. And the least amount of shelter space and housing. There were 3,000 families on the waiting list for housing at the time. And yet, check this out. We have over 30,000 abandoned houses and buildings. So it just doesn't add up, right? And some of those are ginormous buildings like this. This was a old abandoned Catholic church, and it had a school with 40 classrooms. It had a convent and rectory that all just sat vacant for years. And so these families saw this space and said, this is different, right? This isn't just any abandoned factory or something. This is a holy space. This is a sanctuary. And they moved into it, and they started living there. And we read about it. In fact, one of my buddies, I'll never forget, back in the day when we had newspapers, remember these things? Threw it down on the table and said, check it out. And the headline said, Church Resurrected. And it told the story of how these families that didn't have homes had moved into this cathedral that had been abandoned for so long and brought it back to life. And as we kept reading the article, it was heart-wrenching, though. It said that the Catholic Church had given them an eviction notice and said that you're trespassing on church property. If you don't get out within 2 days, you could be arrested. And that's where, as good evangelicals, we held a prayer meeting. And that night, as clear as I've ever heard in my life, we sort of called out to God and said, God, we need you to do something. And we really clearly heard back, sort of the Spirit say to us, I did do something. I made you. Get down there, And so we literally piled in our cars after the prayer meeting, and we caravanned down, and we found the cathedral. And on the front of the building, it said, how can we worship a homeless man on Sunday and ignore one on Monday? And then as we got to know the families, we really organized a student solidarity movement. And at the time, we weren't a huge campus. I'd say it's about the size of Earlham. We were about 1,000 students at the time, and we ended up almost 100 of us were involved in this. So it was like 10% of our campus. So we were talking about it in the cafeteria. We were talking about it in chapel. We were going to sociology classes and organizing and activating folks. And so one thing happened after another, and I'm not going to go into all the stories, but basically the families were so beautiful and so courageous. They held a press conference and they said, we mean no disrespect to the Catholic Church or to the Archdiocese, but we've talked to the real owner of this building, the Lord Almighty, right? And God said we can stay. And they stayed for months, and it was really in the middle of that I'd say it was kind of like my second conversion. You know, I sort of got caught this vision for what it really looks like to be the church. And, you know, in the kind of the ruins of this abandoned church, we felt a new vision for what it looks like to be the church. And we were really inspired by the birth of the early Christian movement in the book of Acts. It talks about how they were together and they shared everything they had. No one claimed any of their possessions were their own. And, you know, that idea like meeting in homes, and the Gospels lived out of dinner tables and lived in the street. And that was what kind of captured us. So this was a long time ago. Back, y'all weren't born, bless you. It was back in the 1900s. But that's where we started. And, you know, for me, there came a point where I sort of said, I'm going to stop complaining about the church that I've experienced and survived, and I want to start reimagining the church. You know, we want to try to, as Gandhi said, be the change you want to see in the world. We want to sort of be the change we want to see in the church. We want to reintegrate this idea of our faith as a way of living, not just a way of believing in the world. And so all that started in there, and it's also where my wife and I got married. So that's our little wedding picture there. Homemade tuxedo, by the way. But that's Katie, and that's our neighborhood. So this was our little stretch limousine that we rode off on after our wedding. And that neighborhood's been our home. So, you know, every place is a little different. So that's why I'm careful to say, like, that living out God's love might look different in your neighborhood than it does ours. The principalities and powers that stand against love and liberation look different sometimes. But so our neighborhood was built around the factories, and it's really densely populated. And the factories have moved out. So we've lost 100,000 jobs in the last 70 years or so, and there's a lot of abandoned space. So I always say, if you believe in resurrection, then Kensington's a great place to live because we get to practice it every day. There's all kinds of stuff that needs to be brought back to life. And in a lot of ways, that's part of our theology. So practicing resurrection, living out, loving people back to life, loving space and even the land, you know, back to life. And a lot of it happens slowly as we kind of reclaim space, and a lot of life happens on the block. So these are our block parties where we open up the fire hydrants, and we actually have a permit in Philly where you close the street. It's called a play street permit. So cars can't even come down the block. So kids can play and not get run over or anything. And so that's like how we do the summers. And, you know, I found that a lot of neighborhoods that are economically poor are community rich. And a lot of neighborhoods that are economically rich are community poor. You know, you don't know your neighbors. And so there's a lot of life in my neighborhood. And so I want to be really careful as I, you know, paint a little picture and share you some stories that I love my people in our neighborhood. And in a lot of ways, we've like learned community rather than transplanting it there. We've been growing it kind of from the seeds that are already there. And so we've watched kids grow up. We've got partnerships now with colleges where we can help scholarship kids that want to go to school. But a lot of it's not too spectacular. We're just getting to know neighbors. We're hanging out on the sidewalks. We're creating ways, rhythms to live together. And as we do think of like new monasticism or some of the old communities, one of the things that was funny was as we started like getting this fresh vision of church, and we're like, you know, activists now, you know, getting arrested and all this stuff. Like there was these nuns, like Sister Margaret up there, that She's 90 years old now, but at the time, as all this was happening, some of these old nuns, they were like, it's great that there's some fresh energy, but there's some of us that have been doing community for a while, so we'd love to learn from each other. And so we started hanging out all the time. She goes, our community's been around for about a while, 1,800 years or so, and so I like to learn from those roots and to learn from the roots of the Anabaptists and the Quakers and Mennonites and different traditions. So this is now kind of an extension of our community. It's called New Jerusalem, and it's a recovery community. So folks are recovering from different substance addictions, and we're in the thick of the opioid crisis, as you all I think experience much of that too, and maybe a little bit of a different form. But a lot of our friends are recovering from substance addiction. So, and on the wall, you can't quite see it, but there's a little quote on the wall that says that we can't fully recover until we help the society in which we grew sick recover. So personal recovery is linked to social recovery. And that's something that was really missing in a lot of the Christianity I grew up with, that it was all about personal salvation, but not about social transformation. And I would suggest it's a little bit of both, that we can integrate those. And God is personal and healing hearts. And God is also healing streets and neighborhoods in a world that's still really plagued by violence and poverty. So this is one of the spaces where I learned. And Sister Margaret's been one of my mentors. So she got really sick and she was in the hospital, and I went to visit her, and she gave me this really dramatic speech about how this might be the last time I see her on this side, but she'll be on the other side waving when I get up there and all this, And then I called to check on her a few days later, and they're like, oh yeah, she got a lot better. It was kind of miraculous. And she just got arrested yesterday at the Pentagon. So I was like, well, there you go, 90 years old and still doing the good trouble. So that's a bit of it. And, just a few pictures of some of what we do is just eating meals together. It's creating celebrations together, right? Where we can, this was like one of our Mother's Day celebrations. And we have almost every month different things that bring us together as a neighborhood, right? So there's almost sort of a liturgy, to use a religious word, kind of a liturgy of our neighborhood and of our community. And this is one of the days that is a highlight for me. It's when the kids go back to school. Not always exciting. So we try to make it super exciting. So we have like the biggest back to school party on the planet. And we had like a 3-story water slide with liability insurance. And one of my friends is Josh Horton, so he's the best juggler in the world. He's a really close friend of mine, graduated from Eastern too, by the way. Juggling Josh on all the socials. But he is right now breaking the world record for he's the person that's broken the most world records. So that's pretty awesome. Put that on your resume. But on our block, he broke the world record for chopping up the most apples while juggling machetes. So, and we did a press release, and we had all it was just fantastic. So, but part of why I like that picture is because we believe in joy, right? And of course, in the Christian tradition, one of the fruits of the Spirit is joy. And it's something that we have to protect, I think, especially as some of the weightier things that we're all navigating and the challenges in our world. But one of my mentors said, if you can't laugh, then the devil's already won. There's an old song that says, this joy that I have, the world didn't give it to me and the world can't take it away. So it's that sort of defiant joy, right? That's what we practice and believe, and there's really deep roots of that in most of the struggles of liberation out there in the world. So, and just to show you a little bit of what kind of it looks like to live out our theology of resurrecting space. And also even just to rethink what we think of as we think of liabilities or assets, and in our neighborhood having all those abandoned houses. I mean, it's heavy. When we first moved there, half of our block was abandoned. In fact, I was driving here and you got a lot of abandoned buildings here, and you look at this, and then we come to find out we can get real estate really cheap. We've gotten houses for $1 Don't even need a Kickstarter for that. You know, $1, boom, boom. And we got this one house and we were settling it. And I'm like looking at all the piles of legal papers and it says seller concession. I look at our lawyer and I'm like, what's a seller concession? And he goes, I think that means they're giving you money to take the house. I'm like, that's even better than buying an abandoned house. It's like, so they gave us $20,000 to take a house. So it needed a lot of work though. And so this is a little like before and after. And what we're doing right now is a model that's been tried a lot of places, just creating community, like literally building it, right? So Millard Fuller started Habitat for Humanity, and he also started Fuller Center for Housing. And the way that they thought about building houses is we won't build a house for you, but we'll build a house together with you, right? And each family puts over 300 hours of sweat equity of work and design and creating their own space. And that's our model. And then we do no interest, you know, because Scripture talks about interest and sin, you know, and so like we don't do any interest on the mortgages. We sell the houses for $35,000, and so we're able to customize the monthly payment based on the household income. So we're building a neighborhood, building a village together, and it's not all perfect. We got to raise quite a bit of money to do that because we sell the houses at a loss. We got to keep predatory lenders from leveraging it, all that stuff. But it's pretty cool to be able to kind of build that, and it's life-changing for a family to be able to have their first home and to build together and to have a whole neighborhood around them. And then, you know, if a kid throws a baseball through the wall, they know how to fix a sheetrock because they've kind of done it together. Or they, you know, if their plumbing has a problem, they know Randy that worked with them to do the plumbing in the house, so they're able to like sort of team up together. And then we're doing a lot of gardening too. A lot of I think some of our holiest work is just getting dirt under our fingernails and growing food and things locally. So this was an abandoned lot that we fixed up, and that's a little glimpse of, even in the back those flowers are made out of hubcaps because we have a lot of hubcaps and tires and things. So trying to use a little bit of everything. And then this is one of our tougher days when we had a big fire that started in one of the 700 abandoned factories owned by the city of Philadelphia. It was a windy day. It had been on fire multiple times. But the fire jumped across the street and it burnt all of our houses down. So the house I was living in, our whole community center, everything was destroyed. And it was terrible. But it was amazing to watch our neighborhood's resilience and community, because what happened was everybody that's house burnt down was kind of trying to make sure everybody was safe. I mean, cars blew up because you didn't have time to move them. It's kind of hard to explain how crazy it was. But the Red Cross set up a shelter because there were 100 families that were displaced. And then the workers came up and they said, no one in the neighborhood ended up sleeping in the shelter because everybody opened their homes up to each other. And they said it was beautiful. You know, so half my neighborhood is real. I mean, my neighborhood is very good at community, and everybody showed up for each other, right? One family, they said they saw everybody with their cats and dogs on the street, and they're like, I'll be the pet shelter. We're like, God bless you, you know, and sent all the dogs over there. And then somebody else started cooking. And then all the reporters showed up. It's one of the biggest fires in Philly history. And so they come up and they're very, opportunistic. And they're coming up to my neighbor that's house just burnt down and said, how's it feel? You know, and my neighbor, it was awesome because they were like, you know what? I'm proud of how we showed up for each other. We're going to make it through this. God's good. We got each other. Not a single person was hurt in this fire. So, we're grateful, and then the reporter's still just kind of dumbfounded. And then the guy goes, my neighbor goes, and since that factory burnt down, I noticed you can see the moon for the first time from our block. So we painted a mural that's got a building burning down with the moon coming up behind it. So it's, but that's kind of, I think it's a good glimpse of how we hope too, right? To hope in a way that our our hope is really relying on God and each other. And when the stock market was floundering, and one of my neighbors, I'll never forget it, he goes, well, no matter what happens on Wall Street, God is still good. And my people have been in a recession for a few hundred years. And God has never left us. So that's kind of what we're trying to build together. And then I'll just show you this. That was when the fire happened, and this is what we've built now. So we call it Phoenix Park because it rose up out of the ashes. And that space is now where we're painting murals. This is a counterfeit Banksy piece. If you're familiar with your street art, that's a Banksy original that we it says at the bottom, thanks Banksy, though, just for the record. And so that's one of our murals. We've got every open wall we try to paint and make it beautiful. And each time we do it, we learn a little bit. We collaborate with other artists locally, and this is one of our more overt theologically ones. You can see the lion, the lamb, and the dove, and the rolled away stone, and the bottom, the kids painted all that in pastels, and it's sort of a resurrection party. And come to find out, our lesson on this one was if you paint a mail container, it's a federal crime. So there you go. If you don't learn anything else, just take that with you. They were very gentle with us. But this is some of the food that we've grown, and the gardens that we've had. We've got a little bit of a food desert, and a lot of the concrete that we live in. It's hard to stay convinced that there's a beautiful God if everything you look at is ugly. So reclaiming space is holy work, and that this is an aquaponic system that is where the fish and the plants grow together. So we've done that for a bit. We've tried all kinds of other little things. We've got bees now. We've got vermicomposting worms and all kinds of stuff. So we're learning as we go. That was a little Swiss chard harvest that we were able to share. So we're sharing a lot of food, and it's a lot of fun. That's on our front door. It says, heal all that is broken in our hearts, in our streets, and in our world. So just to tell you a couple more stories before we open it up so the land where the factory burnt down, this is where that was. It took us years to reclaim that space, but it was a lesson in organizing. We had built these routes for 20 years on the block, and so when the building burnt down, we started saying we would like for this to be a life-giving space to the neighborhood, not just a Walmart or something. And so we had to organize, and each year we began to reclaim that space. And we painted a big letter to the city of Philadelphia. It's been 5 years since the fire. Give us this land back. And we had hundreds and hundreds of signatures, and we organized around it. And then you'll see in this one it says 6 years because we had to paint over it and change it every year, 7, 8, 9. And after like 10 years, we were able to get it back. And now we have a huge community center that's on that space that we dedicated last year. So it's got counseling, it's got a gym, it's got a gymnasium with a basketball court and workout gym and food cafe, all kinds of stuff. So we're building all that together. And then the other thing that we've learned as we sort of try to build this community is that we've got to challenge the things that are crushing people, right? And this is where Martin Luther King is a really helpful guide for me when he said that we've got to expose injustice so that it becomes uncomfortable for the people who have the power to change it. And Dr. King said that the church is meant to be the conscience of our nation, not the master of the state or the servant of the state, but the conscience of the state. And so as we ask the questions, what's crushing people in our neighborhood, certainly one of those things is the opioid crisis, where we're losing about 1,200 lives a year. And all of us are trained in, Narcan and overdose reversals and all these different things. But you start to say, we need some help, right? And this was, so we had this campaign that was actually prompted by the kids. And tragically, it started when we had a big snowfall, and so the kids were going to have a snowball fight. And one of the kids said, we're worried that as we scoop up the snow, there's needles underneath it, and you can't see them when there's snow on it. We're like, that is so messed up, right? That's so messed up. And so we had this campaign called Need a Little Help, where we gathered up all the needles, and we actually put them in jars and epoxied them, and put the names of our legislators and our mayor and health commissioner, and we delivered the needles. So it was a campaign that we hosted a press conference, and the young people delivered a jar of needles to the different political leaders and asking for help. And also we were really clear that the opioid crisis is not about crimes, it's about a sickness, and so we need more resources towards recovery. But right now people are dying, and our kids don't need, have as much dignity as the kids in Rittenhouse, and we need to treat them like that. And we don't need to be stumbling over needles. And so it ended with the mayor didn't come, so that like the kids, you don't mess with the kids, right? They just stormed the gates of City Hall and busted through, and there's all these detectors and stuff, and I'm like, I don't know if you can take the needles through there, and they're already through, so I'm like, I'm with them. So we just kept going, and that's them delivering the needles to the mayor. But that, it moved people's hearts, and even now, our city council members say that they've got that jar of needles on their wall to remind them of the crisis. And we had an emergency response that to the opioid crisis that had a whole bunch of different kind of appendages to it. It's not enough. We still need more, but the whole point is that we need to make people uncomfortable, right? And we need to let, as Dr. Cornell West says, we need to let the suffering speak. We need those that are impacted to amplify their voices and also their pain, so that it becomes a sense of urgency in people's bones. So just a couple other images, I think, of what it means to be that prophetic conscience. This is one of the congregations we're connected to. This is actually LaSalle Street Church, and on the front of their building it says, "Of course we welcome refugees. We're Christians." Kind of like that. And we had a whole, sanctuary movement to welcome refugees. In Philadelphia, our city council unanimously voted to be a sanctuary city to welcome immigrants and families, and the church was instrumental in all of that. This is one of the witnesses that we had as we went to Washington, D.C. This was done in partnership with Dreamers, with young people from immigrant backgrounds that many of them have lived in this country their whole life. There could even be folks here now that are Dreamers, but we went together to the Capitol, and we had 3,000 dreams of dreamers that they had gathered from around the country, and we read those dreams of young immigrants and immigrant families in the halls of Congress, and we prayed outside of the offices, and then we were arrested. But as we were being detained, it was amazing because the one officer said, "We're with you. We need change. We need change in our country." And so I think part of it is our goal is to not accept the world as it is, but to dream of our country as it could be. What if our policies made sense, right? What if there was actually a path to citizenship? What if there were our immigration policies were being shaped more by love than by fear, right? More by compassion than this myth of scarcity. And so those are a few things that we're working around the death penalty too. I know as many of you in Ohio are. Ohio is similar to Pennsylvania, as you may know. And Indiana is Ohio. I'll be in Ohio tomorrow because Ohio is in an interesting place because they still have the death penalty, but they have a governor-imposed moratorium, and that's what we have too. Indiana, I can't remember where you're at on the death penalty. You are not an actively executing state. I know that. There's a few states that are still actively executing, and almost every year a new state abolishes the death penalty. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that later, but this is just one of the actions that we have as we pray at the Supreme Court each year, and we hold a vigil. We hold a prayer vigil outside the Supreme Court. And one of the things that we do is we hold the names of all of the people who have been executed in the United States over the last 45 years or so in what we call the modern era of the death penalty. And we also carry the names of the victims of violent crime with us. And so we hold roses in two colors. You'll see the red and the yellow roses, one for the victims of violent crimes and the other one for the folks who are on death row and folks facing execution. Really clearly our message is like violence doesn't heal the wounds of violence. You don't kill to show that killing is wrong. And in Indiana, as you may know, is the federal execution chamber in Terre Haute. And so one of our demands of the Biden administration is to actually abolish and demolish the federal death chamber. So to actually tear it down. He has the power to do that. So we're working on that. Help him, Lord. So that's a little bit of that witness. And then finally, I wanted to show you just a few pictures of what we're doing around gun violence. So gun violence is right now the number one cause of death of young people in America. It's been that way for African American youth, who are 10 times more likely to be shot than youth in general in America. But during COVID, it became the number one cause of death, more than car accidents or cancer or anything else. Guns are killing our kids. And that's why we say, like, you can't be pro-life and ignore gun violence. Every one of these kids and adults is made in the image of God. And right now our statistic is 120 lives a day are being lost to guns in America. So in my lifetime, 48 years old, we've lost more lives to guns domestically during just my lifetime than in all of the casualties of all of America's wars throughout the history of America. So that's a lot. And it's tragic and very avoidable, right? Well, I mean, we can't save every life, but we can do a lot better than that. So we've been doing a lot of actions in the streets. We've been doing a lot of vigils. And one of the things that we have in Pennsylvania is we call these memorials to the lost, where it's a little tricky to see the picture, but on each one of those T-shirts are the names and ages of young folks that have lost their lives, of people that have lost their lives in our state or in our city. And so just in Philadelphia, it's over 500 T-shirts just from last year. So remembering those and creating spaces like that, right, where we honor the lives that have been lost and we remind ourselves. It's kind of a public grieving or public lament of those lives lost. So I think we've got to create ways to do that in public spaces, and that's one of the ways we do it. The other thing that we do is we've been inspired by this powerful image of the prophets. Both Micah and Isaiah talk about beating swords into plows and spears into pruning hooks. And it's something that inspired the early Christians, so much that they preached whole sermons on this. Like a part of their theology was that we're going to turn a world that's so violent towards peace. And we do that by even as Christ hung on the cross, he exposed all of the violence, put the whole system on display in order to subvert it with love and forgiveness and an empty tomb. And now as Christians, part of our vocation in the world is to follow the Prince of Peace, Jesus, and to be peacemakers. As Jesus said, blessed are the peacemakers. And so this idea of beating swords into plows, though, is so provocative. And it's inspired a lot of different movements throughout the world. And, you know, a few years ago, we said, we don't have many swords in America, but we've got a heck of a lot of guns. We've got more guns than people. Right now, even though, check this out, it starts to kind of mess with your mind, but 2/3 of Americans live unarmed. So by far a majority of Americans live without guns. And yet we have more guns than people. And even wilder is that I like to differentiate between gun owners and gun extremists, because most of my family are gun owners. But they're in the majority of gun owners that say we have a gun violence problem in our country. And there are whole movements of gun owners against assault weapons, gun owners concerned about gun violence. So I happen to not be a gun owner, but I think the gun extremists are those that there's 3% of the population that own almost half of the guns. So we profile one person in my book, Beating Guns, who has 4,000 guns. And you start to go, this is a problem, right? This is a real problem. Not to mention that someone drove a car through his building and ended up robbing him of his 4,000 guns. But anyway, okay, so you can't make this stuff up. So, but you know, we want to beat our swords into plows. So we got our first gun donated a few years ago. It was an AK-47, which is a military weapon that's still allowed on the streets. And you start to say, like, that gun is designed for one purpose, which is to kill as many people as quickly as possible, as many people as possible. And that's what guns like the AR-15 are used for. It's what guns like this are still used for, even in war. And I mean, ironically, in Philadelphia, fireworks are illegal. Brother, fireworks are illegal because people, you know, they can be dangerous, and yet you can still own an AR-15 or an AK-47. We had an AK-47 like that used on our block, and it shot 39 rounds, the police said, in less than a minute. 2 people were killed. Could have been so many more. But this is real, right? This is real. And so that was our first gun, and we turned it into a shovel and a rake. So that was what it looked like after we were done with it. And we've been doing it ever since. And we've also got these images from all over the world now of people that are doing that work. So this is in Mexico. Pedro Reyes has been turning guns into into a whole orchestra with. And this is actually a project of Mennonite Central Committee in Mozambique, where they took assault weapons and turned them into saxophones. Smooth jazz on a saxophone made out of a assault rifle. This is in Iraq, where I spent time, and in the city of Najaf, actually, they put guns in the street and they let the kids run over them with a bulldozer, which is awesome. And this is one of the most powerful ones we had in my neighborhood. And we found this gun in one of the abandoned houses, and we started beating on it together, and then we felt really moved by the Spirit to invite anybody this is the first time we did that, to invite anybody that wanted to take the hammer. And we had one person after another that lined up, and this one mother, she got a picture of her son on her shirt there. She began beating on it. Miss Ryan, she said, "This is for my boy." And she helped to transform that. We did it together, turned it into that's the same gun that we made a plow out of, and we've been doing it ever since. So those are just a few pictures of what we've been up to with the guns to plows. I've got a few of them that I'll show you tonight if you come to the event tonight. But all of that to say that this, for us, this is all what it looks like to try to put flesh on our faith, right? To try to put feet on our prayers, to try to live into a vision of a world that looks a little bit more like God wants it to, and where we turn from violence towards life, where we share things a little bit more freely. And, you know, I think of Dr. King as Martin Luther King. You know, he was assassinated. We were doing a memorial this month on the anniversary of his murder. And a year before his murder was his really iconic Beyond Vietnam speech at the Riverside Church, where he names the triplets of evil, right, of America. And he names them as racism, materialism, and militarism. He also calls America the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And that speech was so unpopular that every member of his board voted against him going public against Vietnam, except for Otis Moss II, bless his heart. Everybody else, and his popularity tanked. And yet, that was his whole point, was it's time to break the silence. We cannot be silent about this. And it's very connected. You know, Dr. King said every time a bomb goes off overseas, we feel the second impact of it in our cities, where our schools are bankrupt and we're spending unimaginable amounts of money on militarism and war at the same time that literally the elementary school next to my house does not have air conditioning. right? So our kids have to be dismissed when it gets over 100 degrees. And yet we have millions and millions of dollars for militarism and war. So Dr. King, of course, identified those, and not just the finances, right, but the morality of it, right? Dr. King said, I've told the young people that violence won't solve their problems, but every time our government uses massive doses of violence to try to bring the change it wants to see in the world, we have a duty to speak out against that. Every time we celebrate war, we teach our kids that violence will solve their problems. So that's all very connected. The work that we've done in places like Iraq and Afghanistan and now in the West Bank and Gaza as we try to work for peace, all of that's very connected, right? And I believe that compassion is not a limited resource, right? We can have and should have compassion and outrage at what happened on October 7th. 1,200 people, precious lives were taken by Hamas. And yet since that happened, we've seen thousands and thousands and thousands of lives lost that are just as precious, right? And my mama taught me that 2 wrongs don't make a right, right? And so we have a duty to try to think, what does it look like to build a better, more beautiful world? And I'm convinced that we're not going to build that world by killing other people's children, and that we need to keep pursuing this vision of beating swords into plows and spears into pruning hooks. So we're trying to, in that sense, we're biblical fundamentalists. But thanks for letting me show you some pictures. And I would love to just open it up. And we've left plenty of space, I think, for dialogue. And
one of the big challenges, I think, of community is how you hold it together, how you keep that vision alive and sustained, how, over time, because that's always, I've lived in a couple of intentional communities, and it takes a lot of work. So how do you keep coming in? You have a great sense of humor, too, which is amazing. How do you keep that with all the challenges that must come up from a group of people?
Yeah, well, I think that community is a bit of a nebulous thing. It's a little squirmy, and I find myself not being too attached to the particular forms of community, because that's changed for us. But the spirit of community has been this sense of a big family, and when we moved in, we had a particular form of community where, me and my 20-year-old friends, we all moved in a house together, and it had an incredible spirit about it, like the Catholic worker movement, like so many other communities, a lot of the monastic communities. We learned a lot. We'd go travel together and visit a different community every year so we could learn from them. Now community's a little bit more of a village. We've got separate housing. We've got a lot of common space that we share and community gardens, but we've got a little bit more elbow room. And some of that's because we've flowed into abandoned buildings and moved into that space. And then our community center burnt down, so we had to recalibrate, so we're always rethinking it. But I heard someone tell me, it was a rancher that said there's 2 ways to keep the cows in the farm. One of them is to build a bunch of fences and gates, and the others keep a really good food source. And that metaphor kind of stuck with me, because I think there's ways of building community that are about gatekeeping and who's in and who's out. And there's other ways that are about creating that kind of common nourishment, and that gravity that we're built towards. So we were able to articulate early on some of our shared values, and I think that's important for any community. We had a statement of doctrines and practices, so like literally the orthodoxy and the orthopraxis, and I think actually I've got one of those. I was teaching a class on this, so I was just using some of the same slides. But so those were like several years into community. These are the different shared values that we identified, and this was not just for our particular community, but the larger movement of communities that we found ourselves a part of. Some that have been around for hundreds of years, some that were newer. So I don't think I'll go into each of these, but like these are some of the things that hold us together, right? Our shared values. They are showing hospitality to strangers. They're sharing economics together. They are caring for the earth, pursuit of racial justice, prayer, peacemaking. We're a nonviolent community, right? So all these things, I think it's helpful to articulate those not as ways of excluding people, but of inviting people into something, right? This is who we are. And if you're leaning into that, even if you're not ready to sign up to all these, like that's who we are. That's who this community is and what we're about. So I think it allows people to find themselves in the community. And even as I look at the community of Jesus, right? There are layers within that community. You see his closest friends and disciples. You also see other people that are sort of leaning in. He's challenging folks that were religious, but they didn't love people very well, and some of his closest friends also betrayed him. And so those lines, they're a little more fluid than we might want to, make them out to be. So I kind of think that we try to stay centered around God and God's love. We are explicitly a Christian community, but we work really well with other communities that don't share our faith, and we have tons of volunteers that are Muslim and that are Jewish that don't aren't religious at all, that are a part of our kind of layers of community life. So a lot of years into it, we described it like an onion. We said, an onion has these different layers, and we used to kind of joke too that some of the outer layers get a little bit flaky, so you want to kind of keep moving in. But that's how I've come to think of community, a little bit more like that than. It's also how I think of my faith too. C.S. Lewis said the world doesn't exist in these extremes of 100% Christian and 100% non-Christian. There's a lot of people that say they're Christians, but they don't look much like Jesus. And there's other people that are loving really beautifully and seem to represent, God's love really well. So let's collaborate with them. So that's kind of how I think of it. So we do have a close-knit community, but there's layers within that, and even in the broader movement too. There's lots of other faith communities and communities that care about justice, even folks that care about gun violence that don't share our faith, but we're going to work together. Yeah, other thoughts? Yeah.
You showed a picture of one church that you had a partnership with, and I was wondering whether you could speak more to the relationship of the community with institutional churches.
Yeah, cool. The question of how we collaborate with the church, we've always had this idea that we're not para-church, we're pro-church. We want to be a part of the larger movement of what God's doing. It's one of the reasons that we didn't start a Sunday service. One of the things that we've never done is a worship service on Sundays. And the reason is that there's church services everywhere. So let's go be a part of those communities. No need to duplicate that, And we've also always had a really diverse group of folks when it comes to the streams of faith. So Pentecostal, historic black church, liberation theologies, traditions of that, and Quakers and Anabaptists and mainliners. So we've always had this blend. That means that we're a part of other spiritual communities than just our intentional community or our neighborhood. What else to say about that? We created a whole project, Common Prayer, which a lot of it's online, just commonprayer.net, and there's a free app that we're trying to update. Costs a lot of money, but anyway, so it's on Androids but not on iPhones right now. And so we have 50 songs we compiled together. We've got a liturgy. We also remembered the saints with a big S and little s from different traditions. So we, that's been really helpful to create sort of a broad net of prayer resources and so does that get at that?
Yeah, and you also had the picture of the church about, of course, we welcome refugees, we're Christian, and I'm wondering about some of the practical relationships you have in terms of community activism and bringing the institutional church into.
Yeah, thanks for following up on that. So, yeah, just as I've seen a lot of churches that do hide behind prayer, just like politicians after every mass shooting will offer thoughts and prayers but not do anything. And so I think that that church can be a place to hide behind liturgy and just compartmentalize faith. So you go Sunday morning and do whatever else you do. But on the other hand, I've seen like really vital faith communities, and some of that are like reinvigorating some of the roots of the, we've got some of the oldest Quaker, communities in Philly. We've got some of the first historic black churches in Philadelphia. The first are there, Mother Bethel and St. Thomas. And so those are all, there's that already there to build on. And on immigration, on fighting anti-homeless legislation, we've seen the church show up. Other people too, but the church, like Christians, explicitly and unashamedly in the forefront of some of these issues. And it's true on Gaza too, like in the escalating violence that we see happening right now. Christians are coming together alongside Muslims and Jewish folks and others. But it's been really, really encouraging. So there's always kind of been two competing narratives, like there's been the wheat and the weeds, as Jesus said, all growing together. But I'm really encouraged by the prophetic faith communities that are out there. And it's true on gun violence and stuff too. I've got a lot of friends that are activists on issues, and they talk about how incredible it is that, I hear a lot. I knew there was more to Christianity than the, sex scandals and the, bling bling televangelists and all the like weird stuff, and so it's really cool, I think, when people experience another narrative of faith. And of course, the Poor People's Campaign, Reverend Barbara and Lissy O'Harris. Lissy O'Harris was an organizer in Philly. We did all this stuff together, like when we were young, and so like all that's there. Dr. King, there's a lot to build on. And there's really cool stuff happening at a grassroots level too. Like, for instance, some older pastors in our neighborhood, mostly men, said there's like a lot of young men in our neighborhood that need mentors. And so they started a male mentor deal called Timoteo, which is Spanish, and it's kind of it's nodding at the relationship of Paul and Timothy, of a mentoring relationship. So they started Timoteo, and then it turned into a sports league, naturally. And so now there's like 400 young men that are a part of that are being mentored by older men. It's got a whole nother side of like women and transcending, gender that's a part of all of that mentoring, and just having older people pour into you. That's really rad. And every one of those is connected to a local church too, which is bringing the church together in a way that these churches wouldn't all agree on doctrine, but they can agree on mission to like pour into the lives of these young people. And now they're creating job opportunities together. And one of the pastors said, here we were talking about how to get young people in the church. It turns out we just need to get out of the church and get into the football field and get into the neighborhood. So I think it's also been good for not just for the young people, but it's been good for the church people too, to get out and to be in the neighborhood. Yeah. Are we good on time? Like 10 more minutes, something? Yeah. Brother, yeah. I see both of you. Yeah, you go first here. Yeah.
Thank you for what you are doing, because you are just trying to help to those people who are in need. But also, my question regarding His Holiness the Dalai Lama, his first Christian father that he met was Thomas Martin. And along with His Holiness the Dalai Lama, the Bishop Tutu, they wrote a book called The Joy of Living. And my question is, and His Holiness the Dalai Lama keeps on telling, not only educate the brain, educate the heart too. Now these days in the youngsters, like what kind of challenges that you face, like when you just try to teach, try to educate the youngsters, especially with the heart, when it talks about the moral values and the respecting others' lives and all these things.
Thank you so much. By the way, my wife and I read the Joy book this year together. Yeah, and I'm very familiar with the work of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and like the conversations that have been turned into books with Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and who's a great inspiration for me. So yeah, I mean, I think that old saying, you know, that one of the furthest distances from our head to our heart, but it's also to our hands. Like, how do we put flesh on this? And so I find a lot of young people, they words are cheap, you know, and so they can hear sermons, read books, whatever, like they want to know what it looks like. And I think that's why it's so powerful that Jesus would say they will know that you're my followers by your love. It's not your bumper stickers or T-shirts. And so people want to know what it looks like. And that's also my theology, is I think Jesus came to show us what God is like in a really concrete way that we can follow after. So, yeah, I find myself doing more and more listening and walking with people and finding concrete ways that we can act together. And Mother Teresa, who's a great inspiration of mine too, she said, our best sermon is our life. So I think that's what Jesus lived for me, was not just His teaching, but the way He embodied that love, even to the very last moments as He was killed, forgiving those who were hurting Him. And so, yeah, thanks for your community and for your heart. And we've learned so much from the Dalai Lama and from your tradition. So thank you. Yeah. I saw you back there. Yeah. Nice shirt. You got a little Dan Berrigan on there? All right. Yeah, come on.
Yeah, so my question is just like, why new? Like, why not just be a monastery? Why not be another already existing radical movement like the Catholic Worker? What's the value in newness specifically for it?
Yeah, cool. First is that the language around the new monasticism, as I kind of said in opening, was not language that we started using. It's I think folks began to use language that it helped them to identify that this is something old, but it's also something fresh. And, you know, as Phyllis Tickle, the wonderful thinker and writer, she was a dear friend, she said, every generation has a new Reformation. You know, she said every few hundred years, the church inevitably needs a rummage sale, you know, to get rid of all the clutter and to also uncover the treasures that have been buried by all the clutter. So I think that it's helpful to have language, though, like monasticism, that says, even though the traditional vows of celibacy or chastity or a rejection of materialism, like they express themselves in different ways. We share many of those same values. The Catholic Worker, the acts of mercy and hospitality. A lot of Catholic workers call us the Protestant Catholic Workers. So, you know, I think that it's helpful to have roots, but it's also, people get stuck in some of that, you know. So I've gone to a lot of monasteries that have lost their joy. And they feel like they have aged to the point that they need some fresh life, you know? I'm not judging them. I'm just saying, like, I think it's beautiful to have the old and the new together. And I see Jesus kind of doing that too. I see Jesus kind of building on the story that obviously He's been a part of for a while, but like He's doing Passover. He's, you know, like reading from the scripture, but He's also healing with mud and spit. He's challenging the confines we put around God, you know? So I think those things need to be done. There's no quote that's like, something like this, you probably heard it, but it's like, tradition is the living faith of the dead, and traditionalism is the dead faith of the living. It's kind of deep, right? So I think there's a very fine line there where tradition can be rich and vital and beautiful and holding to the folks like Dan Berrigan that inspire us. But But traditionalism is when that religiosity, I think, kind of gets buried too much, and we hold to the forms of it rather than the spirit of it, and it becomes its own kind of form of empty religious ritual, or even its own legalism, its own structures that aren't necessarily bringing people to life. So I think there's something to be said for embracing the wisdom of the past, but also allowing the Spirit to move in fresh ways. I mean, Dan Berrigan and folks like that they've been a part of the shoulders we stand on. So I got to know him before he passed away, and so thanks for your shirt and your words. Anybody else before we're gonna have some more time together? But yeah,
I'm wondering if you keep in touch with any of the folks you grew up with in Tennessee. I'm thinking about my own ministerial formation, and I'm looking at some of my peers who are playing on an ethic of fear as opposed to an ethic of love. And I'm just wondering if folks back home understand what you're doing and what some of those conversations are like if you're having them.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've got a heavy foot in Philly, but I still have a lot of love for Tennessee, and we spend chunks of the summer down there. I've got a lot of relationships there. My family's still all there. I mean, I'm really, really deeply concerned about my home state, the policies, the language, the legacy that racism has left there. I mean, it was only just recently that we were able to see the statue of Nathan Bedford Forrest, the founder of the Ku Klux Klan, removed from the Capitol. So, I mean, it took years to have that happen. That's like, if that's progress, we got a long way, you know what I mean? Like, we still have the electric chair in Tennessee. We've still got so many things. So I think deeper than the policies is that it's partly Christians that are championing some of these things that are so overtly wrong, like the death penalty. So part of what we're doing is trying to have those conversations. So like one of the most powerful things we've done in Tennessee is over half the guys on Tennessee's death row that are facing execution have asked the governor, Bill Lee, to come visit them and to pray with them. Literally, their request has been just to pray with them and to hear testimonials of what God has done in their lives. And he hasn't done that yet, but every time there's an execution, we walk about 8.5 miles from the execution chamber to the governor's office, and we deliver that letter asking him. So I think those are things that we've got to do. They're public actions, but they're also private conversations. The governor's in a small group with Michael W. Smith, who I listened to growing up, and like a Christian musician that I think could show courage. Amy Grant, has come out against the death penalty. So Dolly Parton's doing a lot of good, but there's a whole campaign in Tennessee, Dolly for president. But anyway, so I think we need courage, and courage has a lot of different forms. We need it to come from within, not just kind of self-righteously from the outside. But there's so much courage in Tennessee. I think of my friend Justin Jones, who's a very dear friend and, young representative in Tennessee that's, every day showing courage and having his life threatened, and he's fueled by his faith, So I don't want the hateful or the racist or the fearful versions of Christianity to be what people, to kind of colonize and eclipse the whole landscape. Folks like Justin, I think, show us that faith can continue to play a historic role in bringing about justice and liberation. And I'm encouraged, even as the funk is very evident. So, does that feel good? Anybody else want to share before we go? Yeah.
I read about 6 years ago you were confronting Christian nationalism in Lynchburg, Virginia, my home state, and other places and opportunities. And in terms of this kind of confronting brother Christians and sister Christians with love, but still speaking truth to them, especially when they're tempted to be aligned with power and principalities. And can you talk about what you've learned from that and how it might speak to that moment and to the present moment?
Oh, wow, it's a good question, deep question. I guess my first thought is that part of what the guidance that I've found to be really helpful is actually down here, the Matthew 18 is if you feel like one of your fellow Christians is done something wrong or hurtful, you talk directly with them. And I've always tried to do that first. And then it also says if they don't respond, you bring a few witnesses, and then it becomes more of a public thing. But I think that there's a lot of self-righteousness and moral superiority, and it's not just conservative. I grew up with a conservative purity culture, like all that stuff, like, very self-righteous. But there's a justice form of that too. There's a progressive form of that has its own sense of moral purity and theological policing and all those things. So I think we got to be aware of the self-righteousness, and that's why when we went to Lynchburg, like I called Jerry Falwell Jr., who was the president of Liberty University at the time, and I first asked if we could talk and have a private or public conversation. I asked if we could pray together. They asked if they could bring a group of Liberty students to Philly to renovate an abandoned house. I said, absolutely. So we tried. I spoke at Liberty. So there were a lot of backdrop that not necessarily everybody sees in those. And when we had the rally in Lynchburg, it was in the church or in the community center that Martin Luther King spoke in when he was in Lynchburg. It was very deep to be there. And we asked Jerry Falwell if he would come and talk. The question was very specific. Will you talk about how Jesus informs the way that you're engaging politically right now? And he, did not respond to that. Later said that he doesn't really he's not really a person of faith, essentially. He said, I don't look to Jesus when it comes to politics. So those things, I think, began to come out later. But we always start with the hope that people can change and dialogue and not talking at people, but talking with them. We did the same thing to Franklin Graham, who, frankly, I think has done some really, really damaging things when it comes to the public reputation of Christianity. And he goes to the same church as my sister-in-law, right? So those, we try to build those relationships. Right now, I think we need to do similar work with some of the folks that claim to be Christian Zionists, like John Hagee and others that are publicly doing really damaging things. So we're doing that right now, But I would say all that, some of that needs to happen behind the scenes, but there's also a role to play because these are public interactions. The damage that's done does need to be confronted in a loving way. Jesus actually flipped tables in the temple. I'm not going to flip tables, but I do think there's something anger can be holy, right? It's something that Jesus felt. It's how we express and channel that frustration and anger. And I'll just tell you, when I spoke at Liberty, I was quite nervous the first time I went to Liberty University. It's, one of the biggest Christian universities. It's where Jerry Falwell, the religious right was basically born out of that. And I talked about peacemaking. And one of the first people that beelined forward to talk to me was crying. And he said, I am a veteran. He was a young guy. He looked like he was 20, 25 years old. He's like, I'm a veteran, and I dropped the bombs in Iraq. And he says, it is haunting me. And we prayed together, And so I think there's a posture where we've got to look for those opportunities to not kind of box someone in, right? In our own moral superiority. And I think that's a real danger. So there's more to be said about that. But we had one person that came to a rally that he actually used that analogy of flipping the tables. And he said, I was drawn to Donald Trump because I knew that we needed to flip some tables. But I realized we were flipping the wrong tables. And that there was something I was angry about, and I couldn't really identify it. And what was happening was it was being validated, but not in a redemptive way, right? And it wasn't being channeled into the right kind of change, right? So I think there's a lot to unpack in your question, but that's kind of what I would say. Oh, I'll tell you one last story and we'll go. Is when we had this big rally in Lynchburg, and we actually asked permission to go onto the campus to pray. And we were very specific about what we would be praying. We wouldn't bring any bullhorns, no banners, like it's a prayer vigil. And we were told we couldn't go on campus to pray. In fact, we were given a restraining order that if we came on campus to pray, we would be arrested. And this is Liberty. The name is Liberty. And you're like, and the champion like prayer in public place, so you can't make this stuff up. But so we decided, well, we don't want to be arrested, but we'll like deliver our prayers. So we wrote them all out. And Tony Campolo, who's my dear friend and partner and for lots of years of ministry, he decided he would deliver the prayers because he's like 85-year-old Baptists are not going to arrest him, So he goes and he delivers the prayers from all of us to the front office, and the person at the desk says, "You're Tony Campolo. You're one of my favorite preachers." And you're like, you can't make this stuff up, But I think like all that to say is like the Spirit moves through the cracks of everything, and so I think part of what we got to do is try to show courage, but also have humility as we do it, so that we don't end up becoming the same self-righteousness that we see other expressions of that's so toxic. So, yeah. Thanks. Yeah, thanks for listening.